My name's Corey, and today we're making this workbench with leveling feet. To start this bench, I first sorted through my lumber pile to choose the best and straightest pieces for the bench top. The rest would get laminated together to form the forelegs and stretchers. I cut the pieces for the legs and stretcher, then jointed both flat faces of each piece to get a clean flat surface for the glue up. Each leg is 3 2x4s glued together, and the stretchers are 2 2x4s glued together. I didn't have enough clamps to glue everything up individually, so I glued and clamped everything all at once. Once the glue dried, I jointed 2 perpendicular faces of each glue up to get a 90-degree reference point. This allows me to pass the pieces through the thickness planer, making sure everything is square. With the legs and stretchers laminated together and plain square, I cleaned up one edge of each piece on the miter saw and gave everything a quick sanding with 120 grit sandpaper. With the legs and stretchers complete, I started working on the tabletop. I passed each 2x4 through the planer to clean up the faces to get a better glue up. Then sorted through the pile and chose the best looking edge to face up before gluing it all together. I chose to do the glue up in 3 sections. Each section is about 10 inches wide so that I can pass it through the thickness planer before the final glue up. I loosely tightened the clamps, then added a 2x4 on the bottom and top of each end, and clamped those down tightly. This helps keep the 2x4s lined up and flat while they get clamped together. The flatter the top, the less sanding and planing I have to do later. Once the sections were dry, I passed them through the planer a few times to clean up the top and bottom faces, then jointed each edge to make sure that they were 90 degrees to the top and bottom faces. Once everything was planed and squared up, I applied glue to each piece and glued them together to their final width. Overall, the glue up was pretty flat. But if you need your bench to be really flat, you can always make a router sled to plane the entire top surface once it's all glued up. When it was dry, I scraped off the glue squeeze out with a floor scraper, then passed over the entire tabletop with a belt sander, followed by the random orbit sander and 120 grit sandpaper. With all the glue ups done, I cut the tabletop to its final 7-foot length. I clamped a straight edge to the surface and used a circular saw to cut off the excess. Flip the tabletop over, then cut through the other side. Before installing the legs and stretchers, I started working on the leveling feet. I cut an 8-inch length of 5/8" threaded rod and used a flat piece of steel as the faceplate. I clamped a 5/8" nut to the faceplate to line up with the hole and welded them together. Then used an angle grinder to clean up the welds. Now for the actual feet, I used some old hockey pucks. I used a large Forstner bit to countersink the 5/8" nut. Then used a smaller 5/8" drill bit to drill all the way through the puck. I thread a second nut onto the threaded rod to secure the puck, then added the faceplate. But before installing the leveling feet to the legs, I installed the legs to the workbench using through mortises. I started by marking out all the tenons on the legs, then used a table saw to carefully cut out most of the material. To mark the mortises on the tabletop, I used the measurements of the tenons I cut on the legs. I marked in about 8 inches from the edge, then used the shoulder of the leg to measure the width of the mortise as well as the depth from the edge of the bench. And used the full depth of the leg to find the other edge of the mortise. Using a Forstner bit, I cut out most of the material of the mortise, then cleaned it up with a hammer and chisel. After getting a nice snug fit, I cut the legs to their final length and worked on installing the leveling feet. I marked the middle of the underside of each leg, then used a large Forstner bit to countersink the nut that was welded to the faceplate. Then with a 5/8" spade bit, drilled the rest of the way about 6 inches into the leg for the threaded rod. With the legs complete, I marked out where the stretchers would sit and used the table saw to cut away the material, just as I did with the tenons on the legs. I marked and pre-drilled 4 holes into each stretcher so that I can secure them with screws while the glue dried. Once dry, I can come back with a dowel and cover the screw holes. I applied glue to the legs and stretchers and hammered them into place. After checking that everything was square, I screwed them together with 3-inch screws. With the base completely glued up and dry, I carefully lifted the top off the base so that I can apply glue to the legs and tabletop. Then dropped the tabletop back into place and made sure it was sitting flat on each leg. To fill in the gaps in some of the mortises, I cut wedges and hammered them into place with glue. I clamped the tabletop down to the stretchers on the legs and waited for everything to dry. Once dry, I used a flush trim saw to cut the excess leg material that was sticking up through the tabletop, then sanded them flush. I wiped off all the dust and applied a few coats of wipe-on polyurethane to protect the surface. And with that, the bench was done. I'm really happy with how it turned out, and the leveling feet work great on my uneven garage floor. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel.